70. Between the years 1778 and 1947, there were exactly 70 recorded, localized indigenous revolts that literally shook the foundation of the British Empire in India. Now that's a number that really forces you to pause. We're talking about 70 distinct, fierce explosions of resistance from communities that had previously lived in almost total isolation. So you have to ask yourself, how does a global superpower face such relentless, fragmented defiance over the course of nearly 2 centuries?
Well, welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack the incredible history of the tribal revolts of India. We're diving deep into the historical records today to understand the systemic disruptions, the really aggressive colonial policies, and the desperate fight for survival that pushed these isolated tribal communities to fiercely resist British rule.
To make sense of this massive 170-year timeline, here is our roadmap. First, we'll look at the tribal ecosystem, then the causes of the uprising, followed by the mainland tribal revolts, and finally, the frontier tribal resistance.
Starting with Part 1, the tribal ecosystem and what life actually looked like before British rule.
Before the British Empire ever stepped foot in these regions, tribal groups lived in deep geographical isolation. They had a totally unique, culturally distinct worldview, and the historical notes reveal something pretty incredible. There was an absolute absence of conflict with outside caste groups. The baseline of their whole existence relied entirely on 2 main things: community ownership of land and a deeply symbiotic relationship with the forests. They relied heavily on shifting cultivation, which essentially gave them total economic self-sufficiency. Now, they weren't wealthy in a capitalist sense, right? But their ecosystem was beautifully balanced, self-sustaining, and completely undisturbed.
Moving on to Part 2, causes of the uprising, how this entire ecosystem was dismantled.
To understand the sheer anger behind these uprisings, we've really got to talk about the Dikus. This was the tribal word for outsiders. We're talking about a complex, creeping network of British agents, Christian missionaries, and private moneylenders who suddenly flooded into these previously isolated areas. These outsiders became the primary antagonists. They were the main targets of a deep-seated, growing tribal frustration.
You see, the tribal ecosystem was effectively destroyed by what we can call the 5 pillars of disruption. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a total societal overhaul from the ground up. It included a brand new land revenue administration. It included the highly restrictive 1878 forest policy, the sudden influx of Christian missionaries, the arrival of private moneylenders, and, of course, the deeply oppressive policies of government agents and police. To give you an idea of just how invasive this disruption got, government agents even introduced foreign liquor through licensed vendors. Historical notes actually describe this as a severe health hazard that completely replaced their cultural drinks and severely damaged the mental and physical health of the communities.
Looking directly at the historical records, you can see the exact mechanics of how this ecosystem was broken. First, customary land rights just vanished overnight under the new revenue administration, turning tribal chiefs into mere rent collectors. Imagine that. Tribals were suddenly forced to pay rent on land their communities have freely owned for centuries. Simultaneously, the 1878 Forest Act literally locked tribals out of their own symbiotic homes, claiming thousands of acres as reserve forests simply to feed the British demand for ships and railways. It completely wiped out their shifting cultivation and their economic self-sufficiency.
Now, here is where it gets really insidious, this perfectly engineered moneylender trap. It's a classic domino effect. First, tribals were pushed into mainstream Hindu culture, adopting new habits and festivals. Well, suddenly they needed cash for that. This forced them to borrow from those newly arrived private moneylenders, the Dikus we mentioned earlier. This quickly spiraled into a severe debt trap, and the inevitable result? Total land alienation. The moneylenders just took their ancestral lands as payment. It was a vicious cycle of dispossession. With their lands stolen, their forests cordoned off, and their culture policed by outsiders, the sheer pressure had absolutely nowhere to go but out. Which brings us to Part 3, Mainland Tribal Revolts, and the violent push to reclaim stolen lands.
But before we dive into the specific battles on the mainland, the records reveal a really fascinating ideological split. There was a huge difference between how the mainland tribals fought and how the frontier tribals fought. In the mainland, the leadership eventually became deeply connected with the broader Indian nationalist movement, especially after the advent of Gandhi. The frontier revolts, on the other hand, maintained fiercely regional, local, and honestly, sometimes even separatist ideas. Now, you can see just how dense and widespread this geographical reality was. Movements like the Paharia, the Chouar, the Kol, and the Santal rebellions. These weren't just small, isolated scuffles. We are talking about massive regional explosions across areas like the Rajmahal Hills, Midnapore, Chotanagpur, and Jharkhand. These were triggered by raw economic deprivation, the aggressive transfer of their lands to outsiders, and the oppressive everyday practices of those new zamindars and moneylenders.
Just look at how this resistance builds relentlessly over generations. It kicks off early in 1778 with the Paharia Rebellion, fighting against raw British expansion right on their lands. Fast forward a bit to 1831, and the Kol uprisings erupt over the transfer of their territories. By 1855, the massive Santhal rebellion absolutely shakes Jharkhand. And then you have the Munda uprisings, stretching from 1860 all the way to 1920, relentlessly fighting the introduction of feudal tenures and extreme exploitation by forest contractors and moneylenders. It's just a continuous, unbroken chain of defiance.
And finally, Part 4, Frontier Tribal Resistance on the Fringes of the Empire.
These frontier movements had a completely different flavor to them. They were much less about vast national integration with the rest of India and much more about immediate regional sovereignty. Regional records highlight movements deep in Assam and Manipur. Because of their extreme geographic isolation, their resistance was fiercely concentrated on protecting their own immediate local autonomy. They just wanted their backyard left alone. The frontier was defined by some highly unique catalysts. In Assam, the Ahom's revolts between 1828 and 1833 was directly triggered by the non-fulfillment of pledges made by the British Company after the Burmese War. Then you have the Naga movement in Manipur, stretching from 1905 to 1931, led by Jadanang, which had the explicit goal of setting up an independent Naga Raj against British rule. And in the 1930s, the Haraka cult in Manipur, led by Gaidinliu, fought so fiercely that even after being suppressed, it directly led to the formation of the Kabui Naga Association in 1946. These were highly organized, deeply motivated regional struggles.
So bringing this all together, we're going to leave you with this final thought for this explainer. The British Empire sought to extract resources by shattering the ancient symbiotic ecosystems of India's indigenous people. But in doing so, they inadvertently ignited 70 localized, relentless fires of rebellion. While these revolts were geographically isolated and mostly fought for local survival against the Dikus, we have to ask, how did their relentless 170-year defiance ultimately fracture the foundational authority of the British Empire and lay the critical groundwork for the massive, unified nationalist movement that would eventually follow? It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound resistance comes from the margins. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history as it's presented to you.